My father was a quiet man when I was growing up. He wasn't cruel or cold, he wasn't neglectful, he was just quiet. When he did speak, he did so in a mild, soft-spoken tone, the audio equivalent of tofu. It was the voice of a man who just hated stepping on anyone's toes. Mom died during childbirth, so he had to bring me up all on his own. Looking at my life now, I'd like to believe he did a really good job laying the groundwork for the person I would go to become. I think that's a fact a lot of people like to ignore. For some people, the adult life is just a process of getting over it. We waste too much time in life paying for mistakes we've never made, and forgetting and overriding relationships we never asked for. I'm a truly lucky individual to be able to say that this isn't the case for me. Like most people, my childhood is a blur, with a few notable snapshots floating at the surface of the mist. The older you are, the thicker the mist gets, until all the photos of the past look faded and distorted. It's not a long story that I'm here to tell today, but it's one that warrants telling before the snapshot fades. When I was 10 years old, I suffered from a series of inexplicable nightmares. The primary reason for the inexplicable label is the fact that I was still awake while they were happening. And I'm sure a lot of you are already getting ready to tell me that I was suffering from sleep paralysis at the time, but that isn't the case. I could still get up, move, and interact with the room around me. I even made several mad runs to my bedroom door to escape the nightmares that enveloped me, to no avail. That's because, as it turned out, my nightmares were real. It always played out the same way. A shadow with no light to cast it would slither up my bedroom wall, twisted and gaunt like a poorly made scarecrow. Two burning cigarette tip eyes would sizzle into life, and a low growl would come rattling out of the darkness. After that, things got worse.
Stupid boy.
The shadow would hiss in the malignant tone of a bitter old man.
Little fuck up. Raised to be a soft little goddamn pussy.
These were words I'd only hear the bad kids on the playground say, and to hear them spat at me in such an authoritative squall struck the fear of God into me. It's a funny turn of phrase to use looking back, because that thing, that monster, couldn't have been further from God. So many nights bled away, listening to the monster, praying for sleep. I was too afraid to tell my dad. Not because I thought he'd react badly, but because I was worried about putting the monster on his shoulders too. He had so much work to do after Mom died. I couldn't bear to make him worry about this too. It was like the nexus of phobia and insomnia. I couldn't sleep, and I was scared shitless on a nightly basis.
Baby, fuck up. Coward, pussy.
I'd heard more venom in those words of the monster over those few weeks than I had the entirety of my life up until that point. It definitely took its toll. I lost sleep, I ate less, I withdrew myself from friendship groups and my studies in school. The words of that long, cruel shadow were destroying my life, piece by piece. Eventually, something had to give. So I walked up to my dad as he ate breakfast and drank his morning coffee. "Dad?" He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked up at me with a subdued smile. It was just like him, measured and reasonable. He barely ever showed extreme emotion. "Dad, I've got something to tell you. Something bad." There was a flare of recognition in his eyes. He pulled out a chair for me.
"Come sit here, son. Tell me about it,"
he said to me, taking another slow sip of his coffee. I did as he asked, trying to stay calm. I felt like the monster had gotten to me somehow, like it fundamentally changed the way my brain operated. It had conditioned me to be meek, docile, and quiet. "I have problems. In my room." I started to feel that telltale tremor again. I didn't want to tell you, because I didn't want to worry you. And you might not have believed me and thought I was crazy and... By then, I was crying. Hot tears glazed my reddened cheeks. But there was something else. I felt my dad's big, strong hands wrap around my shoulders. He gazed lovingly into my eyes.
You can tell me anything, son. There's nothing we can't sort out together. The problem can seem big, but if you tell me, we can get it solved.
That shocked me more than anything. This is probably an exaggeration, but it felt like the longest uninterrupted sentence he had ever said to me. Hearing him articulate like that gave me the strength to tell my story. And I did. I told him the whole thing. Once I was done, my dad gave a long quivering sigh. He was crying too. There's something unsettling about that, seeing your father cry. He's meant to dry your tears. He's meant to be too strong to cry. That's a silly notion all kids have, until they realize grown-ups are just kids who got better at pretending they have a clue at what's going on. "What's wrong, Dad?" He looked up at me, trying to maintain a weak smile.
My dad, he wasn't very nice, son. He was a really scary guy. He used to drink. He used to say such terrible things. Sometimes he would get really angry. He'd even hit your grandmother. And as I got older, I got better at fighting them off. But in the end, he'd always win.
There was a note of anger rising in his voice.
There was nobody bigger and meaner than your grandfather, son. I spent my nights listening to him chew out your grandmother, and I just wished that he'd die. I wish that he'd have a heart attack and just drop dead, or crash his car on the way home.
He sighed and shook his head again.
Imagine that, wishing death on your own father. Well, I got my wish before I ever met your mother. He had what was called a brain aneurysm, which is like a bursted blood vessel in your brain. The doctors told me he wouldn't even have time to realize he was dying.
My dad gritted his teeth in what seemed like regret during the last part.
He was gone just like that. I was so angry, son. So angry because I felt like he deserved so much worse than that. Cruel, twisted old men don't deserve these kind of endings.
This was the first time Dad had ever spoken about Grandpa. I didn't even know I had one before then.
I carried that anger around with me for a while, son. But the thing about anger is that it's always just fear that got out of hand. My dad, he was afraid of being small, so he made my mom and I feel small so he'd feel big. He was nothing but a loser, preying on the weak. And it took me a while to realize what I was afraid of, son. I was afraid of turning into him, especially after your mother died. I got so upset, you see, and all that fear and sadness could have turned to anger. But I wouldn't let it because I'm not him.
His lower lip began to quiver. A person at any age always knows precipitates the final breakdown. In a matter of moments, my quiet and reserved dad was a sobbing mess.
I'm not him! God damn it! I'm not him!
He splurted through his tears.
I'd never hurt you like that, son. I never hurt anyone like that.
He took a moment to calm down, wiping his tears away with a kitchen towel before turning back to me.
And I'm not gonna let him hurt you either, son. I know it's him. The things he said to you are the same things he said to me. I don't know how he's still here. Whatever ugly black stain of him still exists on the world, but that stops here.
He leaned forward and pulled me into his embrace.
You're my son, not his. That old dead bastard will never say another word to you.
It didn't make sense back then, but now I know why my father acted the way he did, why he was so quiet and reserved. He was afraid of turning into that monster on my wall, into my cruel dead grandfather, and he worried that if he ever lost control, if he took his eyes off that emotional dial twitching in his head, that the monster in him would come out as well. There never was a monster inside of him. My dad was and is the greatest man I have ever known. That night, as I was settling down to sleep, my father sat next to my bed. He held my tiny hand in his great palm, comforting me in the way I assumed God would. That's what they were in the end. God and the devil. What separated them is how they chose to treat the people within their power. Love or malice, that's all it ever came down to. Just then, the shadow stretched across the wall like it always did, and I felt my father's hand tense around mine. Even bathed in all that darkness, he still recognized the shape of his father.
Leave me alone with the boy. You're raising him wrong, Michael. Do you want him to turn out to be some limp-wristed pussy? Do you? I never would have wanted that for you.
What you want doesn't matter.
said my father in a voice that was stronger than steel.
What you want never mattered. You're just a stupid, hateful old man. You had your goddamn time, now get out of our lives.
The shadow seemed to warp against the wall, its red eyes burning brighter.
You listen to me, Dad.
My father began. His voice was laced with a quiet fury.
This is my house. This is my son. If you ever set another foot in here again, I'll drag you all the way to hell myself. And that's a goddamn promise.
There was a long protracted hiss, like air being let out of a balloon. I dared to open my eyes, and when I did, I saw the dark stain of my grandfather evaporate from the wall, leaving the plain blue paint that had always been there. Dad talked a lot more after that. He smiled more. He even laughed and joked around a lot more than he used to. As far as I could tell, he'd finally put that ugly part of his life to rest, allowing him to appreciate what we had. I never saw my grandfather again. It's been over 20 years since then, and sadly my dad is no longer with us. However, as I tuck my son in for bed and sing him a lullaby, before I leave I find myself looking at that plain blue pane of his bedroom wall. That's when it hit me. The best things in life? You seem to only notice them when they're gone. As I lay next to my wife, thinking about our family and the road we have ahead of us, I can only think of one final statement. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for being there for me, for always listening to me, for giving me the childhood you never had. For that, my son and I are very grateful.